Hey everybody, what's going on? Here on the Honest Onyx channel, I like to talk about the lighthearted things in life. I like to try to keep a cool feeling throughout all the content I put up because, the world gets a little bit crazy and a little bit, can bring you down sometimes, and everyone just needs a good picker-upper. So I thought, today I'd bring up that, very non-controversial concept known as white genocide. Now, bullshit aside, white genocide is real. It's a mathematical inevitability. If the white birth rates across the world, and specifically the Western world, do not increase, which every year you'll get less and less whites in the world, which are already a fairly small minority. I should have looked it up before I started recording. I think around 10%, maybe less than 10% of people in the world identify as white. So if those numbers never change, eventually that ever-decreasing amount will reach zero. Now, if this was the only problem that the West was facing in terms of demographics, then the idea of white genocide would lose a lot of its legitimacy. Because birth rates fluctuate all the time throughout history. There are times when it goes down, like in Germany and in the 30s, and it gets picked back up. It fluctuates. It's not static. It depends a lot on different factors. So it's not an inevitability, and it's more than possible and probably inevitable that eventually they will increase, because people either will raise public awareness or in particular the welfare programs, things like Social Security, that helped discourage large birth rates. Because before then, if you don't have a guarantee from the state that you will be taken care of when you're older, there's a lot more motivation to have children, because you can't rely on somebody else's kids coughing up the tax money to pay for your retirement. You have to make sure it stays in the family. So Social Security kind of keeps it down. Another thing I think that plays a pretty big role in reducing the white birth rate is the choices of young women. When you encourage more and more women to go out into the workforce, that will naturally require them to put off having children. And if they keep putting it off, eventually, 3 kids becomes unfeasible when you're 30. You're probably, at that point you maybe have 1, maybe 2. I think that's a factor because it also explains why the black American birth rate is also low, something people tend to overlook, but it's actually below replacement level. I think it's around maybe 195, so not a huge decrease. And of course, the birth rates in Africa are crazy, so you're not really dealing with a transcontinental phenomenon there. But yeah, that would be why I think it's the encouragement of women to go into the workforce is a significant factor as well. Now, like I said, if this was the only problem in terms of demographics that the West was facing, this wouldn't be a little bit hyperbolic to call it white genocide. But the other issue, of course, you have to take into account here, as I talk about a lot on this channel, is mass immigration. When you have mass immigration into a country with low birth rates, that will inevitably lead to the very radical restructuring of the culture in that nation. Because the youth are the ones who are generally the people who push the most for change. The majority of the youth will not be of the native population. They'll be foreign-born or second-generation or even really third-generation. A lot of third-generation immigrants still have that hyphenated identity. Look up Teddy Roosevelt's quote on hyphenated Americans. It's a great quote. I wish more people would have that attitude. We could use Teddy now. We could also use Harambe. Harambe and Teddy, that should be who runs for the 2020 ticket. I'll put my vote in for that. So anyway, so yeah, when you take that into consideration, it becomes a lot more of an existential threat that a lot of white people are starting to get woke to. Now, if anything I've said, comes off is like, you think I'm a racist for mentioning this. I mean, well, number one, like racism as a word has lost so much of its meaning, and it was invented in the 1930s by Leon Trotsky, and it's kind of like the word Islamophobia. I mean, it's a social construct meant to achieve a political end. Now, that doesn't mean there's not bigotry and prejudice. That's that you shouldn't treat people with prejudice. You should, to the best of your ability, give everyone the benefit of the doubt and treat people like individuals, in whatever ways you can. It's impossible to do it all the time. Everyone's just human. Everyone's just got their own prejudices. It's part of life. But I think it's a good principle to kind of aim for. Now that, so yeah, if you can't, if you think I'm being racist for mentioning this, it's mentioning a problem that a group is having does not mean that you're, a racist. If I mention that the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed at the end of World War I, created a lot of terrible economic hardships on Germany and was one of several factors that eventually led to the growth and rise of Nazism and National Socialism in Germany. Me pointing at that Treaty of Versailles and saying, wow, that's really fucked up, fucking over the Germans. It's really unfair. They didn't start this war. Why are you blaming them? That does not mean that I am condoning or encouraging Nazism. It's ridiculous. Or if I mention Asian Americans tend to get in trouble with gambling a lot. They tend to gamble. That does not mean that I hate Asian people. It's just such a ridiculous, stupid way of approaching an issue, and I wholeheartely discourage you from really using the word racism at all. It's such a amorphous term that is so easily politicized. The definition constantly changes, and it's never very clearly defined. So I would encourage you to expunge it pretty much from your vocabulary. It's just too vague. It's useless as a word. Now, that all being said, I do have some criticisms about the term white genocide, specifically because it doesn't, there's more to the story. It doesn't, I think, articulate the problem that whites have as good as it could, or as well as it could. I personally prefer describing it as the colonization of whites. Because now colonization is not just a form of demographic, I guess, warfare, for the lack of a better term, though that's obviously, that brings up another specific, that brings up other specific images that I don't necessarily mean to invoke. But one element of colonization is that it, by sending another group's people into the lands or historically held territories of another group, is that eventually when that new group arrives in sufficient numbers, they can start to wield disproportionate influence over the majority. Probably one of the best examples of this would be the British Empire in India. The British never outnumbered the Indians, never even close. They didn't have to. They just had to send enough of their people over there to start moving into the cities. And the cities are the political, economic, and cultural centers of a nation. It's where all the levers are. And if you can control the city, then you can, by and large, control the rest of the small towns and the suburbs and the countryside. Now, considering the fact that so many immigrants go to cities at first, and they don't go to rural parts of a country, that's not that's a fact that doesn't go unnoticed. They go into cities so that they can maximize their influence, so they can all come together. And this is especially true in a democratic society that has voting as a way of determining its leaders. If you can get your group all in one place, then you can control that place and swing elections into your favor. You can move as a block. And in a multicultural and multiracial society, As it stands now, people are very inclined to move and think and act in a block because it, I'm trying to find out ways of encouraging, everyone to get, to be an atomized, individual unit, but that doesn't really seem to be how human beings think. So, yeah, it's the term white genocide is correct. Like the spirit of what the argument is, the intentions behind it, what the meaning it's trying to convey is basically true. But as I told you, I had a few caveats that I think the term colonization of historically white countries does a much better job at encapsulating and articulating the problems that will come from a combination of mass immigration and low birth rates. Not too long of a video. Peace out, everyone.